Great. Okay. So tonight we have Dr. Stephen Butterman with us to discuss his new scholarly monograph called Queering and Querying the Paradise of Paradox, LGBT Language, New Media, and Visual Cultures in Modern Day Brazil. One of the best titles I've ever seen. So, Steve is Associate Professor of Portuguese and Director of the Portuguese Language Program since 2000, where he teaches Portuguese language courses and Brazilian literature, as well as cultural studies. He does all of that in the Department of Modern Languages and Literature in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Miami, where he also directed the Gender and Sexuality Studies program and launched the minor in LGBTQ studies. While at UM, Dr. Butterman has also held visiting professor scholar posts at Middlebury College, Tulane University, and the University of Sao Paulo. He was appointed by the Institute of International Education as a 2021-22 US Fulbright Scholar to Brazil. He has delivered over 40 invited talks and keynote addresses at universities throughout Brazil, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. He earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2000. He is a recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute in 2002 and Summer Seminar in 2010, and is a winner of the Brazilian International Press Award, Provost Excellent in Teaching Award, and the 2004 University of Miami Scholarly and Creative Activity Award. Wow. He has published books and articles on a wide range of topics, focusing on transnational LGBTQ+ studies, gender and feminist studies in the cultural context of Portuguese-speaking countries. He is the author of Perversions on Parade, Brazilian Literature of Transgression and Postmodern Anti-Aesthetics in Glauco Matoso, published in 2005 by San Diego Press, and Vigilant Invisibility Media Representations of the Largest Pride Parade on the Planet in 2012. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Butterman also serves regularly as an expert witness on asylum petition cases involving homophobia, lesbophobia, transphobia, and domestic violence in Brazil and other countries. I am so happy to welcome you here, Stephen. What an honor, and here we go.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate it very much. I would like to especially thank Amy Rath, who so generously introduced me, the director of the Provincetown Public Library, and also Brittany Taylor, the assistant director, for inviting me to share this book with all of you today. I would also like to thank Professor Ligiana de Moraes of the University of Miami and the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil for her creative, artistic support and technical support as well, and moral support and support in any means imaginable. Today, I have the pleasure, the privilege, and the pride to acknowledge that I'm speaking with all of you from a very safe and sacred site, which for me is one of the most extraordinary places on the planet. The beautiful Provincetown Public Library resides on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Algonquin Nation, the Wampanoag tribes, also known as the people of the first light in beautiful Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I will not take too much time for acknowledgements right now, although they are very well deserved. But if you stick around until the end, I will hopefully have time to make further acknowledgements. But I would like to make a couple of dedications before we get started. The book is dedicated to my dad, Dr. Norman Butterman, in memoriam, and all other victims of the coronavirus and all the families who grieve the loss of their loved ones from afar. So many of us now know the acute anguish of loss compounded by the suffering of not being able to say goodbye. This book is also for my mom, Marilyn Silver Butterman, whose recovery from COVID-19 is a blessing and an inspiration to move forward in dire times. Living valiantly and vibrantly with dementia, my mother occupies a magical parallel universe. Thank you, Mom, for nurturing within me the love of language and the gift of creativity. For Susan Rose, my loving sister, tirelessly fighting the good fight, and to all the members of my family who support and love me unconditionally. To be continued at the end of the talk. There are many, many, many people to thank, and not enough time to do so. There's another dedication that I would like to read in its entirety. I dedicate this book to the memory of the lives and loves of the thousands of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and travesti Brazilian citizens who have been brutally murdered, both in spirit and in body. Though this is part and parcel of my life's work, I began to research and compose the manuscript 10 years ago in 2011. COVID-19 is the most recent calamity to remind us that statistics can record but never reconstitute the human lives they represent, lives that transcend the tragic deaths that can only quantify. They can only quantify. Nevertheless, these numbers also concretize truths that must be spoken. Hence, this contribution is not merely my own, for it is informed by and stands in solidarity with our queer family in proud tribute to their lives, which meant so much more than their atrocious deaths. I humbly offer these pages to the 266 lives lost in 2011, the 388 victims in 2012, the 312 murdered in 2013, the 326 brutally assassinated in 2014, the 318 members of the LGBT plus community executed in 2015, the 343 who perished in 2016 at the hateful hands of others, and the 445 individuals massacred in 2017. This book is for the lives and loves of the 420 documented assassinations in 2018 and the 329 homicides in 2019. This long list of lives lost represents 3,147 Brazilian citizens killed for being LGBT and or T in the period of 1 decade, the time it took for me to research, write, and publish this book. These numbers do not include those citizens whose internalized homo, lesbi, transphobia resulted in their choice to die. As I finish this book, chronicling life in LGBTI plus Brazil and its cultural manifestations within and beyond its borders, setting my pen down halfway through 2020, feels like so long ago, and in the midst of a deadly invisible pandemic, soaring in Brazil as it has in the United States, this devastating new reality has had little impact in a climate where one LGBTI Brazilian is either murdered or takes their own life every 26 hours. This book is also for the countless others who are thriving or merely surviving and whose invisibility in itself tragic may be the reason they are still alive today. I dedicate this book to the readers it will likely never have, to the perpetrators even of these atrocious crimes that have transfigured human lives into mortality statistics, for it is they who suffer from the most insidious disease of all, one that is diminished, negated, or minimized, one that is called many different names, but which I posit here for full visibility: homo, lesbi, transphobia. Finally, this book is for the vast majority who continue to be denied the justice they deserve, the right to be punished for hateful crimes against would-be versions of themselves they so bitterly and brutally repress. So I move now to the introduction, which is called pondering, sorry, get to the next slide. Slides seem to be stuck here. There it goes. Sorry for that. The introduction is called Pondering the Paradise of Paradox, LGBTI plus culture in Brazil today. What began as a book project to represent LGBTQ culture in Brazil in the first 2 decades of the new millennium literally found itself in flux after Bolsonaro's ascension to the presidency on January 1st, 2019. The pun in the former title of this manuscript that many of you have seen in other variations and versions of this talk, Brazilian Portuguese or Portuguese, LGBT language and culture in Brazil today, is no longer funny, nor was it ever meant to evoke laughter. But though I coined the expression to encompass an interdisciplinary marking, or rather remarking or remaking of a conventional heteropatriarchal Romance language like Brazilian Portuguese, much like the sociolex of Polari or gay speak in the United Kingdom or the United States, I believe that the use of the term is no longer sustainable or responsible given the current administration in Brazil, or frankly, very recently in the United States, at the time, especially that I wrote this manuscript. In the US, for example, New York's prominent Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art dropped its gay and lesbian identities, at least from its name. Disturbingly, no argument was made to replace this with queer, LGBT, LGBTQI+, or any other variation thereof. The terms gay and lesbian were simply erased. To be fair, the title adopted a new tagline reading, "The future is queer," with the hope and the executive director's intention that everyone would feel welcome to go to the museum. However, what are the costs involved in not naming the sexual minorities for whom this museum was intended and on whom and whose art and whose lives it was based? What are the social and political consequences of referring to a queer future as if to acknowledge that the present time is not queer and the marker of queerness could only occur in a future yet to come or forever utopian? In an era when political agendas and activism have converged with and through the Black Lives Matter movement, the familiar counter-argument that all lives matter rings painfully present, perpetuating a similar erasure and consequent inequality as the condescending at best or racist discourse of all are welcome or all are equal under the law ignores a global sociopolitical climate where neither is the case or the current reality. So I move now to a section that I call Brazil Covidiano, Coronavirus, WhatsApp, and so what? Some of you may recognize the so what part from President Bolsonaro's way of handling the virus, which persists till today. According to The Lancet, the first case of COVID-19 recorded in Brazil was on February 25th, 2020. At the time of this writing, Brazil had the most cases and deaths in Latin America. And a May 9, 2020 study by Imperial College in the United Kingdom revealed that Brazil is the country with the highest rate of transmission. Of course, things have changed since then. This is both a history project that is contextualized historically, but also sort of a timeline for us to understand COVID in Brazil and its interactions and effects on the queer communities. The article laments Bolsonaro's apathetic reaction to the spread of the virus in Brazil, critiquing in no uncertain terms, quote, that perhaps the biggest threat to Brazil's COVID-19 response is its president. While current US practices to collectively, at the time current, bang pots at home at 7 p.m. were meant to show support and appreciation for the essential workers risking their lives to provide healthcare and potentially life-saving supplies to Americans, pot banging in Brazil often occurs as a protest during presidential announcements. The effects of a careless leader on the well-being of his citizens are certainly not unique to Brazil, but the marginalization of Brazil's most vulnerable minorities also continues well into the pandemic. Throwing caution to the wind, Bolsonaro was repeatedly seen greeting visitors with handshakes and shunning mask use. Put another way, simply because well over, at the time, 100,000 citizens, but now over 524,000 and counting, have perished from a highly contagious virus is no reason to gather antipathy on top of apathy for those Brazilians who are trying in earnest to protect themselves, their families, and the larger community. Several reports and articles on Bolsonaro mocking and taunting staffers wearing masks have been compounded by the president's unambiguous statements he articulated in public that masks are coisa de viado, for faggots or fairies, sending a dangerous signal to Brazilian society that would condone homophobia and perhaps even encourage it during a pandemic. Indifference and antagonism are devastating in a time that requires emergency measures. But this is especially the case when such judgments are transformed into perilous action. In June and July 2020, 2 critical months witnessing the skyrocketing spread of the virus in Brazil, Bolsonaro weakened laws mandating the use of masks in public spaces in order to slow the coronavirus, vetoing several articles requiring employers to supply face masks for their staff. Bolsonaro rejected a decree that would require public authorities to provide face coverings for economically vulnerable civilians, even vetoing bills that would require the use of masks in prisons. He also trashed a law that would have obliged businesses to disseminate information for their employees to properly place and wear masks. Shortly after testing positive for the virus himself, Bolsonaro infamously attended a luncheon in honor of US Independence Day without a face mask, prompting widespread international media criticism by numerous sources, from the Folha de São Paulo to France 24 to LGBTQ Nation in the United States, with a headline of Brazilian president told staff wearing masks is a faggot thing, right before he caught coronavirus on July 9, 2020. Bolsonaro tested positive, as we know, 2 more times, the most recent of which was July 22nd, 2020. I'm going to skip around a little bit for the sake of time. As Brazilians continue to contract the virus to the tune of more than 525,000, as I mentioned, studies and polls are underway to determine not only who is at high risk for developing serious life-threatening disease, but also those communities who suffer the most detrimental impacts to their mental and emotional health. A 2-year national study piloted by the organization Voce LGBT found social isolation to have particularly serious effects on LGBT communities. Initiated on April 28, 2019, the questionnaire confirmed that of the 10,065 LGBT respondents, 28% received a diagnosis of depressive disorder, a pre-pandemic percentage that is 4 times higher than the national average for the general Brazilian population. These numbers, as well as other statistics, have only compounded during and as a result of the pandemic. In 2019, according to the study, 21% polled possessed no income, 21.5% were unemployed, and 97% did not approve of Bolsonaro's performance, giving him the worst possible evaluation of péssima, or horrible. It is worth noting at this juncture that these results do not correspond to more recent popular opinion polls and surveys of Brazil's general population. Datafolha confirmed its findings from polls in August 11 to 12, 2020, noting that in its sample of over 2,000 participants, 47% believed that the president cannot be blamed for the coronavirus-related fatalities in Brazil, while 52% believed that he shared some responsibility. Of that slight majority, only 11% felt that the president is the primary reason responsible for these deaths, while 41% agreed that the president is only one among other responsible parties. Paradoxically, The research found that the president had won the highest approval rating since beginning his tenure in office. Bolsonaro's overall approval rate climbed from 32 to 37% during the pandemic, from the end of June to the beginning of August, while his overall rejection rate fell by 10%, presumably in response to continued emergency stimulus payments of 600 reais per month and less headbutting with Brazilian Congress and the Supreme Court. Brazil's LGBTQ plus population is clearly not the only minority group at high risk during the pandemic. As I show in much greater detail in chapters 5 and 6, trans sex workers are the most vulnerable of all. And since COVID-19, their lives and their livelihoods are in existential danger. In a June 21st, 2020 interview with The Guardian, Stephanie Gonçalves, a trans sex worker from Espírito Santo living in Rio de Janeiro since 2000, put it better than any statistics or academic analysis thereof can possibly perform. She said, "It's really difficult because there's almost nobody on the street. I work as a prostitute. So what happens? It's terrible. I still go out, I still have sex, because if I don't, I'll die of hunger." In the same piece, Indianari Siqueira, the founder of the important NGO Casa Nem, a shelter for LGBT plus people in Rio's Copacabana neighborhood that has recently devoted its attention to producing face masks that trans women work at home to make, states, quote, "This social isolation that society is going through is what LGBT people and especially transvestites and transsexuals have always lived with. I hope people learn from this," end of quote. Needless to say, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, Brazil's sex workers suffer not only stigmatization, but exponentially increased difficulties as they attempt to survive during a pandemic. In her article, Nós Somos Invisíveis, Trabalhadoras Sexuais São Afetadas pela Pandemia, Marie de Klerk interviews several sex workers about their experiences of working in and through coronavirus. Santuzza de Souza, a mineira from Minas Gerais, who's a member of the Central Única de Trabalhadoras Sexuais, the Central Union of Sex Workers, states, quote, "We are already seen as a vector of diseases, and now they perceive us as responsible for the spread of coronavirus," end quote. Irene Santos, a representative of the same organization, the Central Union of Sex Workers in Sergipe, puts the dilemma as a hypothetical rhetorical question she would never ask her colleagues as such. Quote, "How do I tell the girls to maintain 1 meter of distance from their clients? Is virtual sex work an option? Hardly, it seems, when the streets of Brazil's urban centers still exist as solitary sites of solidarity for women, cisgender, transgender, or travestis to claim their space and their livelihood." A study from the University of Oxford, partnering with the Brazilian research organization FAPESP, the Fundação de Amparo à Pesquisa do Estado de São Paulo, the São Paulo Foundation for Research Support, shows that between late February and early March, there were at least 102 international introductions of the virus into Brazil from 18 virus strains, but only 3 of them, all from Europe, created a chain of transmission. 2 strains of the virus prevalent in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro were later found in the Amazonian region of northern Brazil, becoming the epicenter at the time of the pandemic in June and doubling the overall fatality rate in the country as a whole. It is tempting but troubling to view this transmission as an invisible neo-colonialist invasion that comes once again from European soil, devastating any individuals in its path, but especially indigenous communities who, as history repeats itself, have again become victims of first world spreading from North Europe to South Brazil and then North Amazon, again, mirroring patterns of European immigration to and claiming of the lands and the lives of First Nations. It is especially ironic to remember that while Brazilian borders have reopened, reciprocity is not the case. Brazilian citizens have been banned from entering the United States since May 27, 2020, and forbidden to set foot in the countries of the European Union began on July 1st, 2020. So I'm going to, for the sake of time, continue with the final section of the introduction, which unlocks the rest of the book. Written in isolation, just as many of us now spend the majority of our days during the global pandemic, to represent the lack of mutuality in new platforms that no longer hear the receiver, for we find ourselves deprived of the opportunity to fully express instantaneous reactions to the material that presents itself. I invite the reader and all of you to carve out the time and the space to reflect on the works that I'm about to show you, produced in a virtual vacuum, artistic testimonials which speak volumes for themselves in solitary confinement, to respect the silences that lockdowns have imposed on human interactions, whether by choice or coercion. I limit my own interpretations here to the role of translator of only the most basic linguistic elements and allusions to Brazilian cultural references with which the reader may be unfamiliar. I encourage the reader to silently process and to feel the unspeakable effects of isolation in an age of contamination that rather ironically connects us to one another globally, as it is today. The first set of images appear on your screen now. And this is from an exhibit called Quarentena, Arte LGBT mais plus na quarentena, quarantine, via a translation, LGBT plus art during the quarantine. This is, as you see, the first digital exposition from the Museum of Sexual Diversity. Clara de Capua's piece invites us into a solitary worldview that we had no choice but to face. They tell a story that begins with the shock of realizing that we have entered a new world in which we are stuck with ourselves, finding creative and safe yet fleeting means of reconnection with others, ultimately embracing our own skin as we adapt to a world where the exchange of human touch is rare, if at all possible. Ultimately, we are born and we die alone. Many of us suffer from the trauma of not being able to say goodbye in person to our loved ones, whether victims of coronavirus, transphobic violence, or any consequence of our own mortality. We're left to find our inner selves despite and precisely because of forced isolation from others. The desire to build a sense of community while we are all in our own rooms in the house called humanity recalls musician Tom Zay's now haunting neologism, unimultiplicidade, which translates literally to unimultiplicity, a pre-pandemic political and philosophical utopia to which I hope we shall return, and I discuss throughout the book and hope for a new era. So I'm going to move a little bit more quickly now so that you could see some of these artworks. The work that appears now, hopefully on your screens, is called Abaporu na Quarentena by Vinicius Monção. All of these works are from April 2020. In the Brazilian indigenous language of Tupi-Guarani, Abaporu literally means a man, Aba, who eats u people, ora. This piece appropriates and reinvents Tarsila do Amaral's oil painting, in which she gave birth to a mythical figure that became a hallmark of the modernist movement in arts and literature founded in São Paulo during the Semana de Arte Moderna, Modern Art Week in 1922. An icon of Brazilian modernism in the 1920s, Abaporu represents anthropophagy, literary cannibalism, which I don't have time to get into in much detail today. You have to buy the book for that, in which foreign or external influences imposed upon a Brazilian cultural context are eaten, swallowed, digested, and adapted into a specifically Brazilian context. This 2020 rendition of Abaporu reflects life in the pandemic for city dwellers that are alone, despite being surrounded by vast urban landscapes, more melancholic than dynamic, not quite ready to get out of bed. The carpet reminds the viewer that Abaporu is home to stay and to dream of the future, where a basic light bulb replaces the sun in a barren new life, the desert or deserting of outdoor life that the cactus now comes to represent. Here we have a piece that speaks for itself. I think in very corporeal terms. We have Joyce Manges' piece, Prisão Domiciliar, home prison, in which she has inscribed her entire body, as you can see, with messages of survival, of hope, of faith, of anxiety, of depression, of questioning, until when can we move on? And what will, como será nosso futuro? How will our post-COVID future look? What will it look like? The next piece is a work by Akira Umeda, a digital work called Isolations, cleverly and compellingly drawing a historical trajectory between the establishment of safe-sex practices in response to HIV/AIDS, emphasized by the blue condom duly in place, reflecting a moment in history when the medical community taught us how to handle the disease and the precautions necessary to be taken in order to save lives. One that is still relevant today, not only to reducing transmission of the virus, but also other sexually transmitted infections. In the current age of a highly contagious airborne virus transmitted by something as essential and involuntary as breathing, in order to safely connect to another human being, one must extend that condom to cover the entire physical landscape of the human body, thus building a barrier between the self and everyone external to that self. We cannot touch even the works that are on digital display, even as they profoundly touch us, without any hope or possibility of reciprocity. Each person is an island, and not only in metaphorical terms, in a world where physical isolation encompasses our existence. The final piece, which is also the cover of the book, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this, represents a contribution by the House of X, House of She's, a drag family and community of trans-identified artists, and that includes drag queens, drag kings, drag queers, and tranimals, transcending the limitations of our own viral humanity and not simply the gender binary. The work emphasizes unity and difference and togetherness despite separation in a project to create artistic representations of the members of the chosen family that unifies individuals into community of belonging. The expression of that community is virtual, as if the image is crafted to represent the members existed, participating on a Zoom call. The uneven blank squares of whiteness may serve to remind the viewer that there are community members who no longer occupy those spaces through absence or through death. On the other hand, the empty spaces could very well reflect that there is always room for the family to grow and for others to join in the call to be themselves together. I want to read very briefly the actual artist statement. Rather than speaking for or interpreting this piece, I'm going to read a very brief translation that the artists wrote themselves. In the middle of the pandemic, quote, in the middle of the pandemic, we challenged each other to hack into our drag queen sisters. I translated this so it might not sound as eloquent in English as it does in Portuguese. We drew names from the drag house every 2 or 3 days to determine which queen would be the one whose ideas, concepts, aesthetics we would pirate. This lottery would include the winner of the raffle because performing one's own identity can be just as challenging as performing the identity of other queens. The results of these first piracies were posted on Instagram throughout the duration of the challenge. The image presented in the Quarentena, the art exhibit from the Museum of Sexual Diversity, represents the result of these piracies. The idea, this is still the language of the artist statement, is to map out these experimental trials using the practicality of cross-referencing. Who is who? Who is performing whom? We organize the artwork in such a way that we horizontally showcase all the works of each artist. Vertically, however, we are displaying the hacks of each individual artist. Since not every artist performs one another or even themselves, gaps or omissions obligatorily occur. These aesthetics dialogue with the concept of friendship, in which one becomes the other of the same, because it is through friendship that we share the processes of subjectivity passing through ourselves and one another. The organizational apparatus of the images also bears the intention to reflect the structure of individual confinement, each drag queen within her own line and or column, interacting with order, disorder, of isolation, of lockdown, but inevitably shattered by the chaos, the uncertainty, the blank spaces that the pandemic has created. With this, I move now to chapter 1, which I'm actually going to give a very brief summary of, because I want to really focus our limited time together on the more recent research that, that I've done for this book. Chapter 1 is entitled A Decade of Decadence, the Emergence of the Largest Gay Pride Parade on the Planet, which discusses the first decade of LGBT Pride Parade in Sao Paulo. Chapter 1 takes us to 2011. Chapters 1 and 2 take us to 2011. Chapter 3 highlights and examines very closely the most recent stagings, 2012 to 2020, of the event. While examining each edition of the Pride Parades from 1997 to 2020, about 2 decades, I devote careful attention to the politics and the internal bureaucracy of the Association of LGBT Pride Parade of Sao Paulo, which plans and performs the largest pride parade in the world. For example, the 2007 parade drew an estimated 3.5 million participants and spectators, and in 2009, an estimated 3.1 million. According to the military police, this number is markedly higher if the numbers from the Parade Commission are used. In the section of this chapter entitled The Pride in the Press, I conduct a critical study of themes throughout the first 15 years of the existence of this cultural phenomenon in Sao Paulo. To what extent has the motto of the 13th parade from 2009, more citizenship without homophobia, for equality of rights, sem homofobia, mais cidadania, pela isonomia dos direitos, sounds much better in Portuguese. To what extent has this evolved from earlier incarnations of the event? I continue into chapter 3, the discussion on whether the slogans are of a repetitive, cyclical, rhetorical, or chronological nature, and how this pattern may reflect the views of the Parade Commission itself in accordance with or in opposition to the actual participants in the parade, the majority of whom do not identify as queer or LGBT themselves. The chapter also considers the now notorious and rather ironic, given the forward push toward criminalization of homophobia that year, incident of homophobic violence that erupted at the Largo do Aroche, the area of downtown Sao Paulo, which hosts the highest concentration of LGBT clubs and bars in the 2009 Pride Parade, showing that acceptance of sexual minorities, even in a day marked internationally for celebration of difference, is still a challenge in urban Brazilian reality. And there are many, many more examples of this that I don't have time to touch on tonight that I talk about in the book. Careful analysis of each performance of the Pride Parade unique to Sao Paulo furnishes the researcher with valuable insights, such as contemplating whether such events are truly political mega manifestations as they purport themselves to be, or merely a feverish festa, a party which serves a secondary purpose to function as the most lucrative city-sponsored event on the official calendar. According to the Brazilian Tourism Board, for example, the June 23rd, 2019 edition of the parade yielded about 403 million reais in revenue, which is approximately, according to the exchange rate at the time, about 105 million US dollars for the city of Sao Paulo. I examined the repercussions of the tension between the philosophical and ethical goals of the event, oscillating between celebration, including depoliticization, and sociopolitical protest, which prompted the association in 2008 to mandate the removal of the floats sponsored by and advertising bars and nightclubs. I have a couple of slides here that are from the 2011 Pride Parade, just to illustrate some of the mottos. And this became part of, this was actually the lemma or the motto of the Pride Parade, "Thou shalt love one another, end homophobia," which is my attempt at a translation of the biblical love one another, amai-vos uns aos outros, basta de homofobia, enough homophobia. And as part of that campaign, there's the Nenhum Santo Te Protege, Use uma camisinha, which translates as not even a saint protects you, wear a condom, right? Which was a very controversial move. I wanted to sort of highlight what that looks like, what that looked like all over Avenida Paulista during this particular incarnation of the Pride Parade. Other photographs from the 15th LGBT Pride Parade of São Paulo from 2011, which probably do not need translation, but I will translate one that says, I am bisexual, loyal to my desire and to my loves. And interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, the person who's holding the sign does not appear behind it. And of course, we have Minha Filha Lésbica. We have a proud father of a lesbian daughter. Moving on now to chapter 3. And I'm sorry for rushing ahead, but I want to make sure there's time for questions at the end. That's something I value very, very much. So in chapter 3, which is called What's Zapping the LGBT Pride Parade of São Paulo, Fake News and the Uses and Abuses of Social Media Platforms in Digital Brazil, bringing us up to last year. It brings us well into the digital age, of course. While 2012 was a banner year for attracting the largest attendance in the history of Pride parades throughout the world, the chapter focuses special attention on more recent versions of the event, especially in the last 3 years, when the Primeira Parada Virtual do Orgulho LGBT de São Paulo, the first virtual version of the parade, aired on June 14, 2020, and the COVID-delayed live event was twice scheduled and twice canceled due to the ongoing pandemic. Democratization manifests itself not only in calls for collective participation and spectatorship of each edition of the Parada de Orgulho LGBT de São Paulo, but also in the organization's annual call to create the thematic catchphrases each year, and even the text of the respective manifestos, the widely publicized justificativas. The board of the APO-LGBT, the Association of the Pride Parade of São Paulo, meets to determine those mottos every year, but takes into account public opinion of fellow internet users who are also stakeholders in the LGBT civil rights movement in Brazil. A post from February 14, 2019 illustrates this goal for collaboration with constituents. Quote, the board of the association has already met to consider possible slogans, but would also like to know from internet users who participate in our LGBTI plus movement. We remind you that the slogan is a phrase that expresses our feeling in an international context determined in consultation with partners, with NGOs and activists and militants who are involved in the LGBT plus social movement, end of quote. Unique to the 2019 call for participation is the inclusion of the I, representing intersex. No prior editions of the parade have given visibility to this contingent, and the I returns to the closet of invisibility in 2020, when for the first time in its nearly 25-year history, Q, representing queer, finally makes its way into representation of subjectivities, though, as coronavirus would require, only virtually. So I continue to examine the Pride parades of virtual versions of the Pride parades, media representations of them in an age where, as Jean Willis has reminded us in his recent interview that opens the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil's Dialogues for Democracy, new global tendencies to manipulate the internet as a tool to perpetuate a confluence of fake news, a phenomenon whose internationality and scope and dimension is represented by the use of the still hegemonic English language, even in Portuguese. Disinformation, misinformation, post-truth, etc., complicated, of course, by political repercussions of Trump's election to the US presidency in 2016, the emergence of Brexit that same year, and the rise of Bolsonaro and his election in 2018. With the emergence of conspiracy theories and denials of major international historical events, such as slavery in the Americas or the Holocaust in Europe, the international LGBTQ movement did not escape wide-scale manipulation at the hands of new social media outlets. The year 2018 marked a key moment in malicious misinformation propagated by social media networks, prompting the Association of the Pride Parade to prominently display the following message that you see on your screen in the virtual edition of its May 2018 newsletter, Vai ter parada sim. Yes, there will be a parade this year, in which the organization relates that the Pride Parade will indeed occur despite the claims of untrustworthy fake news sources to the contrary, alleging that the infamous truckers' strike of that time was responsible for making it impossible for the floats to ride. The comunicado, the memo, also refers to, though vaguely and without revealing the identity of perpetrators, recent years when similar attempts to disseminate information also took place. Strangely, though, the article takes a curious anti-democratic turn when it points out that the parade is a private event and therefore those responsible for creating falsehoods about it could be sued for damages that may occur as a result of engaging in such intentional acts of deception. Another example of the impact of misinformation and the organization's attempts to dismantle it occurs in the widespread sharing of a visual image that allegedly appeared in a Twitter account called Equal Love for All. Though it was posted on April 1st, 2017, its origins can be traced back to a 4chan misinformation campaign from 2016. April Fool's joke or not, it would be foolish to minimize the impact of deceptively attributing pedophilia, or pedosexuals, as it is noting here, to the LGBT movement. According to a Reuters email interview with LGBT News published on May 29, 2020, quote, a poor Photoshop attempt. This image is all over the internet with different names attached to it, various age groups, etc. We are against any and all forms of pedophilia, obviously. Whoever is spreading these images are trolls and haters trying to give the LGBT community a bad name. We meet them often in our inbox and comments, end of quote. The language used in this attempt to undo damage caused by the homophobic post is problematic, even as it tries to set the record straight, so to speak, and rectify the misinformation. Calling the hackers trolls and haters, though colloquially acceptable, minimizes the fact that the individuals involved deliberately committed a dangerous crime of manipulation and misrepresentation that knows no borders, thanks to the powerful dissemination of the internet at its disposal, one that could potentially lead to higher indices of homophobic assaults. Giving the LGBT community a bad name, quote unquote, is too general and generalizing to make a valid point about community, reinforcing also a view of the community in monolithic terms, a common practice with serious consequences that negates diversity within LGBTQ plus communities, a tendency I highlight in the first two chapters, looking at media representations of São Paulo's LGBT Pride Parade. Finally, the frequency of such a practice, or malpractice actually, is diminished by the statement indicating, quote, we meet them often in our inbox and comments, as if the repetition of the perpetuation of these crimes should simply be brushed off without accountability or responsibility for the numerous, though invisible, damages they may cause. In any case, it is clear that this hate campaign gone viral reached Brazilian algorithms long before the Rudo's fact check process was published in 2020. The July 2018 edition of the association's Pride Parade virtual newsletter cites the poster but places a red X through it to deny its veracity, pointing out the new normal of new media campaigns that attempt to claim LGBT equality movements as falsely accepting of psychiatric disorders and conditions such as pedophilia. It also points out what neither the Reuters piece nor the statement from LGBT News does, the inherent danger of a hate campaign that is actually quite sophisticated in its conception and therefore insidious in its criminality. Quote, some of the sources associating the P with LGBT are so well written that they even led to dissemination of the slogan, love knows no age. I'm going to talk very briefly now as we fast forward to the last year, to last year's June 2020, June 14th, which marked the 24th edition of the parade and its first virtual variation with the following Che Guevara-inspired slogan, "Let's be the nightmare for those who would want to steal our democracy." Urging spectators to participate and take part in the first virtual LGBT Pride Parade in São Paulo, the event was again twice rescheduled. It was originally transferred to November 22nd, conflicting with the weekend of the Dia Nacional de Zumbi da Consciência Negra, Brazil's National Day of Black Consciousness and Afro-Brazilian Awareness. Originally created in 2003 and instituted as a federal holiday in 2011, now observed with state decrees in nearly 1,000 cities throughout Brazil. As a result of this perceived conflict and necessary sensitivity toward the global Black Lives Matter movement, though the intersectionality of the parade's scope could perhaps not be any more pertinent to the day, the parade was moved to November 29th, only to be canceled altogether, with an official announcement issued on July 24th on all social media outlets of the Pride Association, stating, well, the cancellation, essentially. I won't go into the long statement. And what took place instead, as you see in this photo, is the Parade of Solidarity, which became a gathering to distribute basic supplies, hygiene kits, masks, in addition to promoting online dialogues and debates and collaboration with more than 180 pro-democracy, anti-homo, transphobic, anti-racist organizations in Brazil. An excellent case of intersectionality at activist work. I talk extensively about the sort of the corporations and the businesses that supported the virtual parade. I don't want to get into that right now because it's no time, but I did want to note a couple of very important figures and what they stated from the virtual event from last year, because I think it pertains to so much of what we're discussing around democracy. Claudio Garcia, the president of the Association of the Pride Parade in São Paulo, launched last year's festivities, stating rather ironically, quote, "We are occupying the space of virtual expression. You are here participating in the parade right now. We are making our voices heard. Our theme for this year is democracy, precisely because of everything that is happening. Imagine yourselves on Paulista Avenue. We are going to shout for democracy, against homophobia, against racism," end quote. This statement forces us to evaluate to what extent public expressions of protest or demonstration are democratically possible when observers are following from the safety and comfort of their homes instead of actively displacing themselves in order to gather collectively, organizing in solidarity on the streets for the right to be heard. How does one exercise democratic freedom while occupying a space online? Symbolizing at its best an active imagined solidarity based on creative visualization or even magical thinking, while not confronting the reality that a contagious virus has spoken far louder than any combination of voices that would either register support for LGBT liberation and equality or express disdain for these communities. How does the terror of cross-contamination literally relegate the spectator to keep safely behind closet doors for fear of being a contagion or becoming contaminated? What about the millions of Brazilian citizens who may not have access to sufficient broadband to be able to watch the parade online? Is it a more democratic exercise of citizenship to afford expensive high-tech devices and smartphones than to gather the few reais necessary to take a bus to and from the financial capital of Brazil to march for democracy? Fabrício Viana, the journalist responsible for the official online publications and communications of the association, is a voice that appears in all the written archives of the NGO and is therefore cited extensively throughout my book and in the bibliography. He records the justificativa, the rationale for the 2020 manifesto, writing, quote, "On the surface, we seem to be a democracy, but our words and practices do not reflect the theory. What we are seeing in Brazil is a police force that kills and dies more than anywhere else in the world, marches and protests being repressed, accusations without evidence, and a resurgence of dictatorship sympathizers. Thelma Assis, an anesthesiologist from Limão, São Paulo, became a celebrity after winning the competition for the 20th season of Big Brother Brazil's, the BBB 20 edition in 2020, highlighting the intersectionality between LGBT rights and the continued struggle for the equal treatment of Afro-Brazilian women, stating, quote, "There are various intersections with the LGBT community that have to do with my own life story. These are extremely important alliances we have to use to unite to expose an extremely discriminatory society. I identify with Marielle Franco, the Black woman from the favelas that has to fight for her respect," end quote. It is worth noting that Thelma Assis's success and popularity were not based on her medical skills or accomplishments that would defeat the odds of marginalization for being born an Afro-Brazilian woman in São Paulo's periferia. The superpower that distinguished Thelma Assis, as it turns out, was an extraordinary aptitude for dancing samba. I'm interested here in the paradoxical quest for revering ideals of democracy given the lack of any actual measured response, whether with words or any perceivable body language, to heed the association director's call or Thelma Assis's pleas for intersectionality. The new normal imposed upon human thoughts and behaviors may serve as a catalyst for lack of reciprocity and a move toward greater invisibility. To be clear, I am not challenging here the necessity of quarantine to adapt to and to combat dangerous public health circumstances that warrant self-protection and defense of others, but the consequential reality of being met by silence and anonymity that technology enables while clamoring for the continuation of democratic traditions in an increasingly conservative right-wing Brazilian milieu is a metaphor that speaks louder than any human protest or movement has the power to decry. What are the next steps in a fragile young Brazilian democracy that is literally condemned to masking itself as a prerequisite for accessing the freedom to speak and to act? Will a global pandemic that has already laid bare profound institutional racism and classism also widen gaps in access to citizens deprived of resources on the basis of the devastatingly undemocratic reality on the ground? Is this not reminiscent of Lívia Barbosa's definition of jeitinho brasileiro, that all are equal, but some are more equal than others? And if the masks come down and the virus relents, which we all hope is the case, will be the case, will homo, lesbian, and bi transphobia of a contamination and a fascist perpetuation of gender ideology used to justify woeful discrimination on the basis of difference shed its virus more actively, continuing to thrive in a post-COVID quotidian? Or, as sources seem to corroborate at this time, with Brazil's healthcare professionals exercising their perceived responsibility, especially last year, to test vaccines developed in Russia, in China, or from the United States, be among the first to block the continuation of the virus with their very bodies so that multinational pharmaceutical companies can once again reap the benefits of neo-colonization and post-COVID coloniality, one that does not extract wealth like the traditional model, but that alters and allocates health. How do we thank or think of the bodies of volunteers in the global South who are flexing their democratic muscles to contain, sustain, and neutralize the virus in their own collective selves? Will the families and friends of these heroes and sheroes be the first to access vaccinations that could have potentially cost them their lives? Or will global economic markets and political arrangements encourage distribution patterns that would offer protection to the first world first and then recirculate uncontaminated air to the rest? And we see this playing out, of course, today. Chapter 4, which I will not take much time to talk about, changes the venue to the written word, focusing on colorful colloquial language that documents censure and simultaneously condemnation of sexual diversity and gender non-normativity in Brazil. I performed a detailed analysis of 3 recent controversial publications that I don't have time to talk about today, in Brazil and their public reception, all passing as reference books or even as instruction manuals that pertain to sexuality and to theorizing about sex in a Brazilian context. Unfortunately, however, due to gross generalizations, we often encounter moments when the employed language borders, intentionally or not, on misogyny and even homophobia. The danger of these entertaining and liberating pieces, therefore, resides in their own grammar. Upon closer examination, we see that such texts, rather than subverting heteronormative linguistic and more specifically semantic patterns, often serve to reinforce a hegemonic and monolithic view of homosexuality inscribed with racist, classist, and at times misogynist undertones. Of course, there are countless texts like these which have emerged inside and outside Brazil, often bound by the dictates of homonormative models, let alone heteronormativity, which further marginalize women and queers of color by speaking for them rather than representing minority groups in an inclusive manner. In this book, one that focuses specifically on LGBT language in Brazil, it is particularly relevant to interrogate how far, quote unquote, gay speak, or in a Brazilian context, in a trans context specifically, pajubá, even as it has attempted to create new modes of communication and semantic codes to speak from within minority communities, is nonetheless still inscribed and even constructed by recourse to patriarchal thought and white privilege. For the sake of time needing to continue, chapter 5 is entitled Translating Trans in Brazilian Culture. And chapter 4 sort of moves into the 5th chapter by looking at categories not only of trans identities, but also of the language, many times pejorative, used to represent them or to offend them. So I talk about what the T's look like: the trans, transgênero, transformista, transsexual, travesti, look like in a Brazilian context. All to sort of get to a major sort of arc of the book in which I contend that the prefix trans remains at the heart of the book and in the broadest sense possible. So all of my chapters are invested in a crossing over of sorts, aiming to bridge translinguistic features to transmit information and knowledge to transcend not only disciplinarity of academic discourse, but also to foment a productive project of transdisciplinarity, one invested in the language that constitutes, fuels, and ruptures social movements. More to the point, I attempt to show how these very movements become transformed when orthodox or monolithic notions of gender and sexuality are themselves transgressed in a universe where multiple discourses speak simultaneously. One way in which customary and conventional notions of language may be pluralized and problematized is to argue that the discourses around human rights evolves and revolves around a multiplicity of languages, from the bodily to the journalistic, to the satiric and humorous, and countless others. Each of these linguistic phenomena speak to complex performative narratives I examine in this book, stories that are necessarily and most productively subject to diverse readings. I contend that what has become known as gay speak in the US since the early 80s, a topic I talk about much more thoroughly in chapter 4, this linguistic codification has transcended its own boundaries, though certainly not just within Brazil. In an era where access to new social media has transformed the very foundations of how oral and written communication are conceived, I am interested in examining cultural texts where words may or may not be at the crux of their construction. How does an online newspaper article incite political activism differently than, for example, printed matter or even a photograph? How does a televised scene, such as the immensely popular Brazilian soap opera, the novela, influence public opinion on homosexuality differently than an alternative dictionary offering a plethora of words and phrases queered and deployed in unique circumstances designed to assert agency in a homophobic and or transphobic environment? How do future-length films represent LGBT plus identified Brazilians in the country and in diaspora? How does the normativity or heteronormativity of museum studies and artistic manifestations coexist with queer notions of curatorship. How are these performative texts articulated? By whom and in which circuits do they travel? Who are the originators of such discourses? And does their language speak to or for the marginalized populations they claim or aim to represent? How do these respective languages, the journalistic text, the photographic image, the humorous narrative, the ethnographic study, the cinematic spectacle, the artwork in a museum, dialogue with one another and reference themselves in connection to a larger motif of an amorphous, ambiguous imaginary known, or at least named, as LGBT Brazil? It is precisely for this reason, to enrich our understanding of translinguistic discourses, that I choose for examination disparate media sources which bear in common thematically related articulations of language. I would like to posit that studying the multiple meanings these texts denote and connote has the ability to widen our lens on Brazilian culture, provided they are allowed to speak for themselves, dialogue with each other, whether affirming or contradicting their respective discourses. Given our embracing of this Bakhtinian heteroglossia of voices from a variety of social registers and cultural articulations, my hope is to reinscribe an already contradictory Brasil Brasileiro as a queer performative space where sexuality and gender remain in a constant state of flux. In utilizing and analyzing these multiple discourses, I do not make any claim that their conjunction will make it more possible or even desirable to name or define a space that is unique to Brazilian cultural tropes or imaginaries. Instead, I argue that the apparent contradictions that emerge from this work in constructing a collage of such languages, one that is not necessarily typified by competing confrontations, but rather more invested in collaboration between and among them, is at the heart of this journey into understanding the Portuguese that speaks for itself. The message or messages of this language are, of course, as multiple and varied as the interpretations thereof. For me, though, one thing seems certain. Within the multiple deployments of these disparate discourses resides a call for liberation for both heteronormative and homonormative institutional and sociopolitical structures to transform a patriarchal past into a pluralistic present, where each text has the right and the responsibility to speak its own language, even if that language leads us to a blank page, an empty stare in a photograph, a silenced or hushed word, an interviewee's self-censored omission, and a question mark in reaction to a work of art. Is liberation from homophobia and transphobia possible to flourish in a patriarchal, rigidly gendered society like Brazil? You'll have to read the book to find out. Chapters 5 and 6 are invested in giving much needed attention to the lives and the work of travestis, making every attempt possible to avoid exoticizing or romanticizing existences, but inevitably and necessarily failing in this regard, insofar as it is virtually impossible to peel off multiple layers of marginalization and misconceptions operating on complex levels to objectify one of the world's most stigmatized, if not the most despised class of individuals. Simply by virtue of studying trans lives and attempting to represent trans voices becomes an objectification of lived lives, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully presented. I fear this is true in any scholarly study, the present one included, which positions transgender lives at the forefront of analysis. Whether the discipline is anthropology or ethnography, sociology, psychoanalysis, or historical in nature, nevertheless, what I hope to convey in these chapters, particularly the 5th and 6th chapters, is both the merits and the dangers of the universalization of trans Brazilians as a category of political identity and as a metaphorical space for ambiguity and fluidity in the multiple and queerly contradictory constructions of gender identity. Clearly, conjoining trans identities into one monolithic category has political advantages and disadvantages. For one, the all-encompassing trans makes various transgender, transsexual, male to female, female to male, and travesti communities subject to manipulation and erasure on the basis of the important inherent differences between such identifications. On the other hand, some scholars have argued that for the sake of collective organization, uniting forces under the same umbrella is a political necessity to attain visibility. As Viviane Namaste also points out, trans individuals and communities, regardless of their differences, often share in common similar, if not identical, experiences of discrimination. However, as Namaste urges, and I quote, "I suggest that social scientists recognize that there is not one large transgendered community, but rather several small networks of transsexual and transgendered people, as well as many TS/TG people unaffiliated with other individuals like them. This insight thus cautions against the simplistic use of the word transgendered, since this umbrella term may erase the specificity of different transgendered and especially transsexual individuals," end of quote. When writing about variation in trans communities in any cultural context, the academic and the activist alike inevitably encounter serious ethical issues very difficult and perhaps even impossible to overcome. The issue of universalizing so as to build strength in numbers and a multitude of identities within those who would classify themselves as gender variant may also lead to invisibility, intentional or inadvertent invisibility, of difference among trans-identified individuals under the T-shaped umbrella. Similarly, staking out multitudinous identities runs the risk of diminishing the numbers of trans-identified individuals and manipulative erasure by both heteronormative and homonormative hegemonies, who might and often do reject gender identity as a valid category of existence. At the least, the T in the rainbow of colors, when not despised, is often overlooked or neglected as a constituent worth fighting for. We see that this is slowly and hopefully changing. As such, even progressive-minded gays and lesbians sometimes feel threatened by the T in the equation, arguing, and to some very narrow extent correctly, that the fight for social and political equality for sexual minorities is a separate battle than the struggle for equality between and among gender variant identities. Western tendencies to classify or categorize poses a great challenge, if not an enticing opportunity, to the scholar or activist who attempts to write about the levels of marginalization in the daily lives of trans-identified individuals. Indeed, one must confront the most obvious rift between academic research and political activism. Can these two roles be connected without sacrificing the principles of one or the other? Is it possible for the academic, immersed in the study of our subject, to refrain from objectification of difference, even as she tries to point out the importance of not conflating nor segregating such differences? More specifically, within academic circles, is it possible to write about trans issues and trans people without the obligation to stake out an ethnographic approach, a psychoanalytic model, or a sociological platform? Can the all-encompassing spirit of the ambiguity of trans be articulated in human language without unwittingly falling victim to exoticization, victimization, over-politicization, idealization, or worst of all, dehumanization? And by this, I mean whether declaring trans as subhuman or subpolitical, or romanticizing difference to attain a sacred, godlike quality that would lift onto a pedestal otherwise ordinary human beings struggling daily to live their lives in a violently transphobic world. As part of this intellectual project, one that is deeply invested in a close examination of language and linguistic codes to create, or as is often the case, to repress meaning, there are inevitably many moments in which, and here I'm talking much more specifically about various scholars that I prefer to, unfortunately for the sake of time, leave for your reading or for another time, and move to chapter 6, which is called Tracing the Trenches of the Travesty, Trans Photography and Artivism in Brazil. And I'm actually going to skip over this first part, which, though I would love to discuss it today, I worry about not having enough time and making sure to respect everyone's time here. So I think that these are images that I photographed way back in 2011 from the Orelhão, right? It used to be the the public phones in Brazil, and they're still in existence, of course, but with the advent of cell phones, much less so. And these photos were taken in Cinelândia, right, in Rio de Janeiro in 2011. And what I talk about in this section of the book is analyze from the perspective of both critical race theory, gender and sexuality studies, sort of how the idealization of the travesti plays itself out in a Brazilian collective consciousness. So what you're seeing, of course, are advertisements for sex workers and how they racialize themselves in many cases, also how they name themselves and designate as versatile, active, and or passive. And it's just a fascinating kind of view that brings us into the realities that corroborate ever since David Brookshaw's branqueamento thesis to the present, at all socioeconomic levels of the whitening of Brazilian society. So I move now to a central part of the project, which is to look at SOS Dignity, Projeto Nome Delas, which translates literally as the project in their name, in the feminine, and look at human rights via art, sex work, work ethic, and the ethics and aesthetics of representation, which is at the core of this book. It sounds like everything is at the core of this book, but this is really kind of hitting the nerve, that moment where we are looking at this sort of simultaneous creative arts outreach, artivism, and the legal work of an organization like SOS Dignity that brings us squarely into the center of the debate between objectification or exploitation through the camera versus normalization by eroticizing sex workers with the attempt to restore their humanity or dignity as individuals. So the question that I ask is, do these photos project sensual poses or familiar faces? This is particularly important in a climate where many travestis are rejected by their families, expelled from their homes, and begin work as prostitutes as early as age 12, some preparing themselves and transforming their bodies in preparation to work in Europe, where they hope to make enough money to better their financial situation. My research shows, and this is a very simplistic summary that deserves a lot more time that we don't have today, that SOS Dignity represents the troubled relationship between art and politics as much as it zeroes in on the necessary link between academic scholarly work and sociopolitical activism. We must therefore take particular care in assessing the lives and the experiences of a population that is especially vulnerable to commodification and imperialism. The eroticized Brazilian body is a traveling exhibit, once inserted in a global spectacularization, masquerading its carnival carnality abroad. This myth is one of the most dangerous stereotypes of all, that these sexualized and sexually adept, multi-gendered, exotic Latinxes exist to be used as objects of satisfaction. And here you have several photos that were taken from expressions of the Hidden City in 2007, presented publicly at the Conjunto Nacional de São Paulo from the Barry Michael Wolff collection. I'm going to go through these very quickly. In interpreting these images and the bright, alert, and fresh faces, we sense a positive support center or group for these young individuals where they're able to exist without fear outside of the all too prevalent streetwear trajectory for young trans women. Some of these photos represent subjects who appear to be in their prime of a long, happy life. This notion is juxtaposed, of course, with the sobering reality that as of 2018, the average life expectancy for travestis and transsexual Brazilians is 35 years old, compared with the Brazilian population in general, which is 74.9 years old. In their 2008 dossier on murders and violence against travestis and trans people in Brazil, statistics from the National Association of Travestis and Transsexuals and the Brazilian Institute of Trans Education indicate that 60.5% of the homicide victims are between 17 and 29 years old. Most of the models in these photographs would end up as victims of murder, HIV, AIDS, or drug overdose. One of the many paradoxes we find in this powerful collection of photographs helps to guide us on a slippery slope and paradoxical path where the ethics of representation becomes the centerpiece of a theoretical battleground that continues to be staged upon trans bodies, a triangular space where empowered subjectivities come into conflict with imposed objectivities vis-a-vis the objectifications that both the camera and the photographer perpetuate, and the role of the spectator constituting meaning from the work of art. The images that you are looking at poignantly portray the complexity of the work of an activist artist and artivist like Barry Michael Wolff. Many of the models cast in the photographs, such as Bia from Belém do Pará in northern Brazil, reflect an exponential widening of not only the stigma of living with HIV/AIDS, Bia ultimately died of the disease at the age of 19, but also what Black feminist critic Patricia Hill Collins brands the matrix of domination, in which there occurs a multiple layering of discriminations that intersectionally overlap, leading to a deeper marginalization and stigmatization. In Bia's specific case, there are at least 5 levels or layers of discrimination that her mere existence represents for a Brazilian viewer. In addition to being a trans woman, Bia is a retirante nordestina, an immigrant from Brazil's impoverished north and northeast to an economically more prosperous megalopolis like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, or Porto Alegre in southeastern or southern Brazil. She's also the vulnerable victim of the structural violence of poverty in a deeply class-conscious and classless society, with a dark-skinned body in a country where racial discrimination and institutionalized anti-Black racism unfortunately finds one of the most protected harbors in the Western world. Additionally, Bia is a victim of a stigmatized virus that would eventually lead to her death, as we know, at the young age of 19. While I acknowledge the critical importance of giving name or names to the victimization of Brazil's most vulnerable citizens, the objects of the camera are also subjects, empowered with the agency to accept or reject the terms of the contract under which their faces and bodies transform into viewable objects for consumption and capital. At this theoretical juncture, Pierre Bourdieu's work on multiple spectatorships reminds us of the multiplicities of motives and intentionality of all the actors in this process. For example, it may be useful to assess the degree to which travestis who are sex workers may agree to pose for the camera as models of idealized feminine beauty that they can then utilize to exercise or enhance performance of their profession. Although there's no question that violence occurs as a result of stigmatization of the individuals objectified by the camera, the photographer's intent is to sell their humanity, human dignity, whereas the hope of the model may very well be to sell her work, which would include her body, her beauty, while she develops or adds to a portfolio that she may use to attract clients. For this reason, it is incumbent upon the critic observer to carefully distinguish between how they are viewing the photos while not discounting the agency of those who chose to participate in the project, self-empowered with new photographs they may use to sell their image, whether to future clients, to an estranged family, or even to foster self-confidence while receiving positive attention and successfully performing their own idealized notions of femininity. These are all possible narratives that may clash with how the critic or even the photographer may perceive or analyze the life of the photographic images extending beyond the lives of the individuals who ultimately chose to contribute to the project. This perspective not only forces the spectator to view sex work as legitimate client-building recruitment activity like any other position in sales and marketing, but also resists the discourse of moralization of a conventional work ethic, often reserved for work regarded as suitable in a cis-centric heteropatriarchal context, one that judges, denies, and shames prostitution as viable or valuable work. And these are some more images. And finally, this is a different exhibition from the same artist, from Barry Michael Wolff's work called Portraits of a Trans Marriage, which gives me much hope. While the series contains about a dozen photos, I've chosen just 3 to display here. What is different about these family portraits, other than the fact that the objects are not displayed alone and in erotic poses we have become accustomed to seeing in most instances, is that the parents are present, appearing proud and happy, and the gender identity of the individuals in the union is irrelevant to the sanctity and the joy of the momentous occasion of union or marriage portrayed and celebrated in these photographs. Bringing us to, for those of you who are still with us, and I'm sorry that this is a very long presentation, but it's almost concluding. I'm going to have an abbreviated conversation about chapter 7, extremely abbreviated because we really don't have time to get into the film clips that I would have liked to have shown. This is a book project that took 10 years, but I don't have 10 years and I don't expect you to have more than a couple of hours to be able to listen to this. But I just wanted to give a list of the feature-length films that I consider in the chapter, as well as the curtas, the short films that I discuss in chapter 7. I'm looking at films from 2001 to 2020. Chapter 7 offers readings of cinematic representations of queer diasporas, with a focus on cultural representations of Brazilians moving through, between, and toward various forms of deliberate self-displacement, geographical, existential, and identitarian in nature, emphasizing the motif of fleeing home in order to reinscribe and reconstruct what I call, in this project, home. This chapter is inspired and nourished by Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza from 1986, charting a journey that has as its objective a gradual transition to queer homes of their own invention. As such, I analyze the creation of queer utopias, alternative families and communities, and the depathologization and normalization of transgender, travesti, and transsexual character development, diverting the attention of the spectator to other societal taboos or quote unquote problems that result from patriarchal impositions. Specifically, well, I don't have time for specifics, but I will show you some images of the films that I consider in this work, and also offer a very brief but I think poignant and important quote from currently in exile from Jean Willis, who in the first edition, the first episode of Diálogos pela Democracia, the US Network for Democracy in Brazil's first episode, and I'm going to talk about the US NDB, I'll give you the reference at the very end of the talk. There's a quote that just struck me as being representative of where I'm going with this notion of forgetting and forgetting far away from home. Cinematic representations of 21st century LGBT trans Brazil, with the emphasis on trans, in which Willis states, quote, "Exile places you in the category of migrant. My biggest difficulty in exile is the question of language, because I am a man who adores speaking Portuguese." Of course, I translated this into English. "I know the Portuguese language was imposed by the colonizer. The Portuguese language is the colonizer within me. This is my contradiction. I love the language the colonizer gave me because it is from within this language that I take action against colonization. It is also because of this language that I engage in the work of decolonization. The work of decolonization is also linguistic work." Much more to say about this, but these are the films that I consider: Dois Perdidos numa Noite Suja, Praia do Futuro, Hoje Eu Quero Voltar Sozinho, both the original Não Quero Voltar Sozinho, the short film, and the feature-length film. But I don't want to give any spoilers in case you haven't seen these films. So, and Tatuagem is one I consider with some detail, and a whole monograph, and I'm sure has already been written or should be written just about Tatuagem, and Madame Satã. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into it. I'll just say that the reason I selected these films is I argue that they possess an affinity and a common strategy to queer not only childhood and adulthood relationships, but also the conventional that is Aristotelian notion of cinematic narration. For example, the queer portrayal of male same-sex relationships occurs in many of the films through questioning and problematizing monogamy as the only or even the best way to conduct a relationship. The next section is called Queering Trauma While Anxiously Awaiting Tragedy to Come Out to Pass, which I don't have time to discuss. And we finally end up in chapter 8, which is the last chapter I will discuss with some detail. It is also critical to the visual arts, visual cultures aspect of this presentation and to assessing how democracy is employed or disempowered, as the case was with the Queer Museo. In this chapter, what's queer got to do with it? So the final chapter of my book brings us to the August 2008 re-inauguration of the Queer Museo, Cartografias da Diferença na Arte Brasileira, Cartographies of Difference in Brazilian Art, at the time in Rio de Janeiro. After 2 highly controversial and successful attempts at censorship, it brought to the forefront a multiplicity of intersectional issues that echo, dramatize, and metaphorize, even metastasize, Brazil's sociopolitical divisions, despite, as exhibit curator Gaudêncio Fidelis called it on numerous occasions, villainy of fascist state involvement, religious fundamentalism, and pernicious support for censorship of cultural initiatives designed to destigmatize creative production by and or about Brazilian gender and sexual minorities. This intervention questions the paradoxically productive and destructive role of stigma when subscribing to queer theory's insistence on anti-normativity. The brief but volatile history of the museum's opening, its subsequent censorship in Porto Alegre, the use of social media to resuscitate and resituate itself in Rio with the largest crowdfunding campaign in Brazil's history, reveals larger debates on freedom of speech, citizenship as activism, art as a site of cultural resistance, and the limits of reception and spectatorship on the basis of sexuality, gender, race, and even age. For example, a judge ordered on the eve of its opening that children 14 and under not be permitted to visit the exhibit. While the order was suspended days later by another judge, these actions and reactions stage current debates in Brazil on ideology of gender arguments that continue to suppress gender studies and LGBT queer studies at all levels of the curriculum, from the anti-homophobia educational kit at the secondary level to the repression and commission of aggression against Judith Butler's physical and scholarly body of knowledge. Continuing to problematize simultaneously conflictual and consensual relationships between aesthetics, that is artwork, the chapter discusses the ethical imperative of the museum as a cultural institution invested in creating space for and representing the cultural artifacts of marginalized citizens, the rules of censorship, and the roles of freedom of speech in a democracy increasingly positioning itself in an ambivalent queer space and time, to recall Jack Halberstam's excellent work, consistently questioning the fragile foundations upon which it is employed and revoked in today's Brazil. All at the same time, calling for the democratization of contemporary curatorship, transitioning into a new collaborative model of what I would like to call queeratorship, C-U-I-R, or you could spell it the queer way too, queeratorship. And in this last segment of my talk, I would like to take just a few moments to talk about some of the works, only about 5 or 6 pieces because of the lack of time. So the photograph you were looking at now is the first work of art that I noticed upon entrance into the exhibit. O Ministério da Saúde adverte: o Brasil é o país que mais mata bichas no mundo, prompting the spectator to look up almost to the ceiling to see it, and if heeded, to exercise caution upon proceeding. The giant poster on a black background with 3 different font sizes and colors imitates and parodies the warnings mandated to be placed on cigarette cartons about the long-term dangers of smoking and tobacco use. The Ministry of Health warns, Brazil kills more faggots than any other country in the world. The font size of the content of this warning is enormous, highlighting the magnitude and definitive nature of the problem, comparing the reality and severity of the violent consequences of the addictive habit. That is, certain and brutal death that may not come about swiftly, but is the inevitable consequence of the world's most violently homotransphobic society, one where machismo is a high-risk vice that causes others to die. The difference, of course, is that this illness is socially constructed rather than chemically formed, and that it does not target the individual who is addicted to the practice, but rather the object onto which the consequent hatred is placed, or rather misplaced. Written in all capital letters and appearing in a hot pink color, one that universally represents the international LGBT movement, the stern warning, while mimicking governmental intervention in labels and packaging of consumer products, makes no claim that the perpetrator of such crimes will suffer punishment or responsibility, even for murder, as the warning is conceived as an inevitable, even chemical, outcome of a homophobic society. As a spectator viewing an intervening warning before setting foot in the queer journey that is the exposition, it is imperative to ask who is being advised. There is no distinction made here of perpetrator, or victim, suggesting that these crimes are conditioned by a society that perpetuates their commission with impunity. The colloquial use of bisha, a pejorative but reclaimed slang term that I examined extensively in chapter 4, is made even more informal by using the homophonic and homophobic X in the place of the CH, as if to say X marks the spot, as a spectator is greeted at ground zero of queer expression and creativity motivated by an egregious social situation that reveals the enormity of Brazil's lethal homophobic legacy and positionality in the present. The use of the present tense warns, adverte, indicates that the crime is both present and unavoidable. Despite its naturalization and lack of punishment for its commission, I read the use of capital letters here as an exclamation, which in the age of social media jargon has come to symbolize a shout, as we know, a denunciation against this injustice. The third and final phrase, written in the smallest of the three fonts and in yellow, that for Brazilian spectatorship represents the national flag, of course, also signals the eyes to move slowly, pausing so that the words do not go unnoticed or unprocessed. A literal translation of the phrase reads as follows, quote, vulnerability, physical, artistic, mental, in transit, affect or affective, economic, educational, workplace, familial, spiritual, political, structural, institutional life in Rio de Janeiro. The inverted syntactic structure of the phrase, while difficult to capture in English translation, requires the reader or spectator to reconstitute the meaning of the words and their grammatical usage. Put another way, each of the adjectives employed to describe vulnerability transcend not only any attempt to define or placate the nature of that vulnerability, but also the parts of speech or better use of language to denote it. For example, in Portuguese, the use of the term institucional can allude to both institutional and institutionalized. Vulnerability is present in structural factors that include education, even manners or etiquette, modes of behavior considered appropriate in the context of the Romance languages, as well as the educational system at large. The multivalent noun empregancia denotes the workplace, but simultaneously refers to labor rights and conditions. In sum, while the warning gives us indicators of possible side effects, much like we would read on a medicine bottle or a prescription label, the list that ensues encompasses every conceivable area of human life, running the gamut from lack of acceptance or rejection from the family unit, to discrimination at the place of employment, to compromising mental and emotional health, to lack of access to educational opportunities, even denying the right to develop a personal spirituality. After noting the warning and entering the Queer Museo at my own risk, I felt at ease, at qualm, when I noticed the presence of two trans people of color working as docents in the museum, providing clues to help spectators interpret artworks while fielding questions from audience members, a refreshing sign of the exhibit's inclusivity. So I will limit my theorizations now and go right to the works of art so that we can appreciate these together. Celebrated Carioca artist Adriana Barajal. This is the piece that's called Cenas de Interior 2, was commissioned to produce a seascape mural to encircle the new aquatic center built for the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio. Also contributes to the Queer Museo exhibit with an equally, as the New York Times characterizes her work, fragmented, reordered, and turbulent. Cena de Interior 2, a sociopolitical denunciation of slavery, racism, sexual exploitation, and violence perpetuated against people of color. Accused by the Movimento Livre do Brasil, the MBL, of promoting zoophilia, and implying that such work could influence the impressionable to commit acts of bestiality, Varejão resurrects an ancient Japanese art reminiscent of the shunga prints, a type of erotic art in the traditional style of ukiyo-e. Pardon my speaking in Japanese, I do not. So, which is referring to a genre of Japanese wood block print and painting from the Edo period in order to critique structural, physical, and sexual violence throughout history and regardless of the location or site in the world. It is worth noting, in a parallel situation to censorship of the Queer Museo exhibit, that these artworks, literally translated to English as spring pictures, were banned in Japan for the majority of the 20th century. In the New York Times article I quoted from earlier, Laura von Straten writes that much of Varejão's work, quote, asks uncomfortable questions about the hidden bloody stories of racism and subjugation, Portugal's colonization of Brazil in particular, but also England's and Spain's or of other parts of the Americas, quote unquote. The piece shown at the Queer Museo certainly reinforces this characterization. At first glance, the spectator is prompted to trace this work to another piece that does not exist, an original work perhaps from Japan. The title, Cena de Interior 2, Indoor Scene Number 2, tempts us to find an authentic work of art on which this piece is based. Nevertheless, this search would occur in vain because there is no recorded original work of this artist's authorship or any other with this title. The implication of a second set implies a series of work, or perhaps metaphorically, a reoccurrence of historical processes, of colonial legacies that this piece both playfully and repulsively displays. Appearances are deceptive in much of Varejão's artistic universe. The object appears to have been produced on rice paper, reminding us of an ancient Japanese scroll kept for centuries with stains and both horizontal and vertical lines indicating that this document has been preserved for years, folded and wrinkled to connote the old age of the piece, perhaps acquired by an art collector. However, contemporary viewers will recognize that sadly, this is a tragic story, history, told over and over again, depicting historical processes that repeat themselves despite time and place. There are 9 characters portrayed, men and women of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, involved in sexual relations with one another. In one case, we witness 2 white men with an animal. The bottom right corner of the artwork features 3 men, 2 white and 1 black man, who is sexually serving the other 2, both orally and anally, reminding the viewer that even same-sex relations cannot escape from racist colonial legacies where the animalized bodies of slaves were objects to be used for both economic gain and for sexual pleasure. Varejão thus denounces patriarchal exploitation and rape culture in the same brush. Neither the black slaves nor the unidentified animal has a choice about participating in these relations, which are displayed with no judgment except that which the viewer confers upon them, of course. It is, of course, no coincidence that the white men in the bottom corner are the only 2 wearing modern clothes, marking both their racial and gendered privilege, while simultaneously reminding the spectator that this painting is as historical in nature as it is contemporary, as if to say, look what was happening in the past and look what still happens in the present. This confers a somewhat ahistorical timelessness that may speak more to the universal violence in human nature than to specific cultural contexts. There's also the depiction of an interracial couple, a white woman with a black man, which of course would not have been tolerated in a racist colonial framework. In this complex piece, there are different horizontal levels with separate scenes. However, when the viewer mentally flips the painting, all the sexual scenarios are vertically connected with a pillar on the left side, transforming into stair steps. All of the people portrayed are practicing sexual relations in different constellations with the singular similarity that all are having sex. The portrayal of the 2 women in the top of the drawing appears different than the rest, and only in part because it is upside down. The spectator voyeur perceives a more intimate exchange of sexual relations, where there's a sense of agency, implying freedom and playfulness in the sexual connection between the 2. Of course, tolerance or acceptance of erotic love between lesbian women and not just sex for the attention and attainment of pleasure of the male viewer would turn heteropatriarchal societies on their head. I know that I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'm just going to show a few more images. This is Bia Leites, Travesti da Lambada e Deusa das Águas, also known internationally as Queer Child, originally from 2013. Denounced by the MBL as promoting, guess what, pedophilia, and censored for partaking in strategies for quote unquote recruitment of otherwise innocent Brazilian youth in conjunction with the ideology of gender campaign to vilify LGBT populations. Not only do these paintings appear to have been done by a child, but they also offer the queer spectator a glimpse back to our own childhoods to redefine such a formative period of our lives in a way that removes negative judgment or condemnation for not adhering to the heteronormative scripts of childhood. In this taking back of shame and bullying, the spectator views children in different phases of psychosocial development. The similarity in the features of the blue-faced boy wearing multicolored trousers with a younger version of himself in a neighboring panel represents a revisionist rethinking of childhood development in a queer positive light. The non-binary youngster proudly wears their skirt. The tall child with the yellow sweater is either riding a pony or is himself a centaur, representing the rich fantasies and imaginations of children when creativity is allowed to flourish on its own, uninhibited by heteronormative impositions. For Bia Leites, queer children clearly represent the freedom of self-expression and to explore identities without censure. This utopian vision of an unfettered childhood contrasts with the damage children regularly suffer because of parental regulation or what they learn is acceptable and normal in school classes and on the playground. The return to a happy, spontaneous childhood that Leites' work offers for us is one that nullifies all forms of repression of difference, from left-handedness to conversion therapies to religious exorcism to straighten the queer. Social reality, unfortunately, is quite the contrary. And the psychosexual violence perpetuated on children carry permanent lifetime scars when, and sadly in many cases, if we live to become adults. With attention to the time, I will show you Fernando Barril's 1996, Cruzando Jesus Cristo com Deusa Shiva, breeding Jesus Christ with the goddess Shiva. I have an extensive analysis I will not say here, but there's obviously a lot to notice and comment on this wonderfully irreverent queer piece. The next one is Antonio Obaz et Verbum from 2011, in which we have, I have an extensive, I'm not going to go into detail. You could see here that we have the Holy Communion wafers as they've never been packaged before, inscribed with words that carry sexual connotations, if not break silences that repressive moral codes of religiosity regularly omit or openly condemn. Here we have Flavio Cerqueira's Amnésia from 2015, which boldly speaks for itself, documenting the invisibility and continued marginalization of Afro-Brazilian citizens and culture, despite the fact that Afro-Brazilians comprise more than half of Brazil's population and constitute the second largest Black population in the world. Images of the against censorship of the Santander Bank in Porto Alegre, when the exhibit was told it could, the people around these that it could not continue. But I'll go to our happy ending because our story actually, despite all of the censorship that the exhibit experienced, this story has a quasi-Hollywood-esque happy ending, at least quantitatively, if not qualitatively, because of the crowdfunding campaigns. And ironically, paradoxically, because of all the negative attention from the conservative right, including the mayor of Rio de Janeiro at the time, whose name I will not mention, the Queer Museu was safely installed at an alternative location in Rio from August 18th to September 16th, received a total of 8,000 visitors in its first weekend, with a wait time of an hour and a half, 14,000 visitors in its first 10 days, and drew a total of 60,000 guests by the end of its brief reopening. And to conclude this talk and the book itself, I have an image here of one of the two docents in the Queer Museo. If I had time, I would play a clip of her describing the piece that we're looking at, but I don't. So you will see here on the screen that she's narrating a series of videos called Cidade, o Espado de São Jorge 1, 2, 3, and 4, an artwork from 2013 that represents the historic ban to enforce a 12-month waiting period for LGBT Brazilians to donate blood, imposed by Brazil's Ministry of Health and lifted on May 9, 2020, after nearly 4 years in court. The artist, Christos Nóbrega, used his own blood to create the swords of St. George of Cappadocia, a plant of African origin brought by African slaves to Brazil, where it has flourished. It bears spiritual significance in Candomblé. The format of its leaves is likened to the sword of the Orisha Ogun, with a capacity to protect, purify, and cut out the envy of the evil eye, bringing prosperity to its practitioners and removing negative energies from their homes. And with that, I will end the presentation and open for the Q&A in a moment. I just want to give special thanks to Amy Raff, wonderful director here at the Provincetown Public Library, to Brittany Taylor, assistant director here at the P-Town Public Library, who also organized this event and the beautiful flyer that she put together. Ligiana de Moraes dos Santos, PhD candidate at the University of Miami. Obrigado a todos presentes. Thank you everyone for being here. I have my contact information. I would love to receive questions, comments. The more challenging, the better. I promise to respond to any email that is sent to me in response to this presentation. And my last statement is to learn more and get involved, if you're not already involved, in the LGBTQI+ struggle, is to please read the latest statement from the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil that I have linked here to this presentation, entitled Defending LGBTI+ Rights in Brazil, that just came out days ago at the end of June. And I will stop sharing now. This is what that report looks like. And with that, I would like to open for questions. Amy, if there's any, thank you so much. Let me stop my share. And now I see everybody. Wow.
Great. Steve, thanks so much. That was an amazing presentation. I imagine some of your students are on this, and I'm really jealous of them. They really must benefit from your research and your amazing mind. And it would be great if we could have like a chapter a week discussion group or something like that. But anyway, I digress. I'm gonna pause the recording for the Q&A because of the politically sensitive nature around some of the issues raised in the book, so people feel safe about asking and sharing without it being recorded. So I'm going to do that now, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat.